This is International Master Eric Kislik, and today we'll be looking at the game Aronian Caruana, played in round 7 of the Candidates Tournament in Berlin. This was a surprising game because Caruana won with black against the usually solid Aronian. He tends to lose very rarely with white, so I was quite shocked to see him lose a couple white games this tournament. So let's take a look at how the game continued. The game went d4, knight of 6, c4, e6. So it started off as a kind of standard queen's game, but declined. d5, knight of 3, d takes c4. So Caruana doesn't usually play the QGD Vienna, but he opted for this line. Apparently he's prepared it quite deeply. And Aronian actually himself played this earlier in the tournament through transpositions. So e4, bishop to b4. And generally black tries to play c5 to try to get counterplay in the center. So bishop g5 was played, and now h6. Bishop takes, queen takes, bishop takes c4, and now black needs a pawn break in the center and goes for c5. Castle, c takes d4, e5. So this is a line I've seen quite a bit of analysis on. When I was an opening helper for a 2700 player, I was helping him prepare this line with black, and actually he won the game that I helped him prepare for against Vladimir Kramnik, which can't really do much better than that as a second, so that was a pretty nice moment. But fortunately, everything went our way, but it didn't necessarily have that much to do with the opening, and actually Kramnik got a pretty reasonable position. But I'm sure Caruana had perfect preparation here and just reached an equal position. So knight e4 was played. White has sacrificed a pawn here temporarily, but he has the threat of going queen to b3 and then going rook f to d1 and winning back the d4 pawn. So black just castled, queen e2. And one of white's plans is to go rook a d1, knight g3, and queen e4 to win back the pawn. Bishop e7 was played. So one of black's plans is just to go queen b6, rook d8, bishop d7, knight c6, just complete his development in a normal fashion. So white played rook a d1. He can also play rook f d1. Rook a d1 is probably the most natural based on the plan that he opted for in the game. You'll see in a few moments. So black played queen c7. He plans to attack the e5 pawn. He needs to get counterplay quickly. White plays bishop to d3. Here he actually has a couple of interesting threats. So one of his threats is to go knight to g3. So if black ever goes g6, white can go h4, h5 to try to undermine the g6 pawn to try to create an attack towards h7. The other idea is that white can play bishop to b1, which may involve black piling up here. Of course, with the queen on c7, we can't go queen c2 right away, but if the queen is blocked, for instance, by knight c6, then bishop c2 will be an option. So black goes knight to d7 and attacks the e5 pawn. So knight to g3 was a reasonable option. For instance, rook d8, knight h5, knight f8. So with the knight near the king, generally black is very solid here and hard to attack. For instance, if rook c1, queen a5, knight d2, black can just play bishop to d7 and has a very solid position. So in the game, he opted for rook c1, attacking the queen. Black just moved the queen away to a5, still attacking the pawn on e5. And now white went for g4, which was probably pushing it. It's a bit hard to tell exactly what his preparation may have been here. It seemed like perhaps he had just worked this out to a proximate equality and thought he could play this and wouldn't have any objective problems. The safer way to play it would just be to go knight e2, defending the pawn. Black can play, he can play queen takes a2, rook c7, queen takes b2. And despite the fact that the queen seems to be awkwardly placed, it doesn't quite get trapped. Because after queen a3, knight c4, there's queen c3, and everything here seems to just about work out for black. So let's go back. And knight c5 can be played here if bishop b1, rook d8, a3, we can go queen a6. This is the safer way to play it with black, just challenging the queen on e2. So going back to the game, g4 was played. So it's worth pausing and just looking at the position because it is a pretty shocking continuation for someone at this caliber to play in such an important game and in this kind of round. So Caruana doesn't really have another choice. The threat is g5, and he really has to take the e5 pawn. So he went after e5, take, and now f4 was played. So it's a tricky situation. Should he go queen a5? Should he go queen d5? How should he try to defend here? So if queen to d5, g5, king h8, this seemed to be a little bit better. And as you'll see in the game, the queen actually would have been pretty well placed on d5 rather than where it was. So for instance, if rook c7, we can actually just go queen d8, rook f c1, bishop d7. We can give up the b7 pawn in order to go rook c8. which actually helps us quite a bit. So black would be slightly better in this position, which appears to be the best response to the sacrifice played by Aronian. So after queen a5, g5 was played, and now black opted for the safest way to play. He could have played g6, although now there's a really nice line. I admit that this line probably would not have been found by either player. h4 is the best move rather than taking, because if you take, then there's king h7, and black can just take the pawn. He's up 2 pawns. So there's probably just not enough here for white. But if he plays h4, there's e5, and now there's a pretty amazing line. Here's the line the computer gave, which I think would not have been found by either player, perhaps, but it's really quite crazy. f5, bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, g takes f5, and rather than moving the knight, there's simply rook f1, h takes g5, knight g3. So this is quite an absurd looking line, but it works out to be okay. For instance, queen e5, bishop takes e4, and now there's the threat of perpetual check, starting with knight h6 check. So if here, there's knight h6 check, king g7, knight f5 check. And just to illustrate why you can't play this, so if you go here, then there's knight takes f7, rook takes f7, and there's queen h5 check. So that's the reason why you can't play that. So it's a pretty amazing line, I'd say. But g6 would have definitely made it difficult for Aronian to play in this position. So he simply went back with queen to d8. He wanted to go bishop d7, rook c8, and complete his development. This was an extremely solid way to play. So white went h4, black went bishop d7, and now he prepares to either go rook c8 or bishop c6. He's just trying to improve his passive pieces. So g takes h6 was played. Black absolutely needs to keep the position closed, so he should go g6 or f5. f5 was also interesting. A little bit, it looks a bit wild though. After knight g5, rook takes g7, king h2, queen b6. Everything is still defended though, but it's quite a wild position here. Probably black is okay objectively because he's put white's king in an awkward position by attacking the f4 pawn. So g6 was actually played, h5, king h8. So the king's out of the way and is not easy to attack on the dark squares here. What would have been the best way for white to play now if he was content with the draw, which I assume he was playing for a win here, was to go h takes g6, f takes, and knight c5. And now, after taking, white has the idea of going rook g5, attacking the g6 pawn, and most likely the position's going to be very drawish. For instance, h7, rook g7, take, 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 take. And now we reach an endgame with rook, bishop, and 4 pawns versus rook, bishop, and 4 pawns, which is probably going to be a draw. So this endgame would have been equal. So after king h2, he played bishop c6, carrying out his plan of improving his bishop. And now white simply put the rook on the wrong square. He went rook f3, should have played rook f2. And after queen to d5, which is where the rook should have been before, or the queen should have been before, h takes g6, f takes g6, rook g1, attacking the g6 pawn. Black can still go bishop e8 and still has a small advantage. It's not easy for white to attack now. But in the game continuation, it should have been much worse. So rook f3, now queen a5 should have been played. And here's the idea, just simply taking the h5 pawn. So take, 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 rook e1, rook a e8, and white just does not have enough here. So this would have been immediately winning for black. He went bishop d6. This was pretty understandable too. White went queen f2 to attack the d4 pawn. Black retreated with bishop c7. Stronger would have been bishop takes e4 with the idea of takes, e5 takes, and queen to h4 check with the idea of entering this endgame. And admittedly, this position is quite complicated. It is still fairly drawish here, but this would have been a slightly stronger continuation than what was played in the game. So after bishop c7, black is threatening to go g5 because he has the pin on the f4 pawn. So white went king h3 to break that pin, and black went queen to e7. This was apparently just a safe way of playing. What would have been stronger was queen to d7, and after queen to d7, black threatens both bishop takes e4 and e5 check. So if here, in this case, he would just go bishop d8, takes, takes, rook g1, rook g8, and here black has a big advantage. And it's important that he's covering the f6 square with his bishop on d8. So queen to d7 would have been stronger. The only problem with queen to e7, threatening to go rook to g8, is that white could have played this and then simply doubled. And then now he has this nice move, rook takes g6, which is a beautiful move, perhaps even deserving 2 exclamation marks. Takes, takes, And now the threat of g7 check is very powerful, so it actually could even make sense to just go rook takes, and bishop takes. So in this position, I think it's just going to end in a draw. Black can go rook g8, trade off the rooks, takes, check, king h8, and the king on h8 is safe, and the position is probably going to be a draw, although black has slightly better practical chances because he's up a pawn and his king is safe. So going back, also black could play the kind of comical rook to g7, rook g4, but we don't have a better option than taking on g6 here anyway. So we actually have to go for the same variation as before. So anyway, knight to g5, it did have some threats. White wanted to go rook takes c6 and knight takes f7 check as in the game. Actually, black could have played bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, g takes h5 with the idea of playing queen e4, f5, takes, bishop to d6. So black would have still been slightly better in this case. But e5 was a very strong move. And you'll see that black should have been objectively winning in the game continuation. So rook takes was played. That was his main idea, so it makes sense to examine it. If takes, h takes g6, then black can play check, f5, rook to f6, and now the pawns are actually stopped. So it's better to play it the way that he did. Takes, knight takes f7 check. Pretty beautiful full rook sacrifice. So takes, and now he had a chance to win the game. This, I can totally understand, is very difficult to evaluate during a practical game because you just can't see that deeply. What should have been played was rook takes f4, takes, queen e5. The point being, check, king g8, only move, bishop c4, check, king h7. So he needs to be able to go g8 queen. So he checks the king away, king takes h6, and now he queens. So take, queen h8 is a nice little move to play king g5 check, next move. King g5 check, and now queen takes b2 check. So in this position, black is up 2 pawns, which is a little bit hard to convert because of the opposite colored bishops, but black can go queen to b5 now. So if here, queen e4, queen e5. So imagine if you reach this endgame, which is quite likely. For instance, if queen h6 check, we can go queen h5, and we'll reach an endgame as well. So here, after queen e5, takes, king to f3, I'll just illustrate a possible way that black can convert this. He basically just moves his bishop over to d2 and just walks his king in, and the king just runs all the way around. c3, king c5, king b4, and black wins. So this apparently is just winning for black after rook takes f4, but it is also understandable that Caruana missed it simply because it's quite complicated. He may have concluded that that line was a draw during the game. So rook f6 was played, g7 check, king to g8, and now white's best was the move queen h4, and this is very similar to what he played in the game, so we have to assume that he probably saw the idea. What he may have missed here is that after e4, h7 check, king takes, rook check, king h8, he has a draw by perpetual check. Takes, bishop check, king g7 check, and then he has the perpetual checking on g8 and g5 repeatedly. But what happened in the game is bishop c4 check was played, and now he simply did not have an attack after queen h4, e4, rook g3, bishop takes. So yes, he did have to give up the rook, but after takes, king to h8, the threat of both bishop takes g3 and rook takes h6 is winning for black. So now, for instance, if rook g6, we can check, queen g4, take, and this is resignable for white. So in the game, he played rook g7, just hoping that there would be a blunder at the last second, and black went queen f8, and with rook takes h6 coming up, white resigned. So a pretty crazy and complicated game. It looks like it was simply decided by blunders from both sides. It wasn't exactly clear. I mean, it looked like Caruana's overall strategy in this game was just to try to be as solid as possible. You can kind of see that with some of his moves, like with rook f6, and you can kind of see that a bit earlier with the way he played, just with queen e7 a bit earlier than that, around move 25. So exactly on queen e7 and bishop c7. So it seems like he just tried to hold Aronian off, and he succeeded. And eventually Aronian went a bit too far. He missed a way to draw, and he lost. If you like the content, consider subscribing. Thanks.